The sound came first, iron shrieking against frozen tracks. Then, the train appeared through the fog. Winter 1945, near Reims, France. Allied guards watched as the boxcars groaned open. What stepped out didn't look like soldiers, more like shadows wearing threadbare grey. German women, their hair matted with soot, clutching dented suitcases and prayer books. Nurses, clerks, secretaries pulled from collapsing fronts and captured in the final chaos of the Reich. One stumbled on the icy platform, another caught her arm. The guards hesitated. Then, from the side, a Red Cross nurse rushed forward. She wasn't armed, just holding a blanket. Her boots crunched in the snow as she knelt beside the fallen woman, wrapping her without a word. The German's lips trembled, waiting for a blow that never came. Instead, she heard a calm voice in English, "You're safe now." The words didn't register. Safe from what? From whom? Inside the camp, floodlights buzzed. Wooden barracks lined up like exhausted soldiers. The air smelled of kerosene and boiled cabbage. Reports indicate that by mid-1945, over 3,000 German female POW were held in French camps alone. Many former Luftwaffe auxiliaries or army typists. They were not prepared for this kind of captivity. They had expected vengeance. Instead, they got blankets. A British guard muttered to his partner, "Bloody strange," in knit. "They look half our sister's age." The women avoided eye contact, their military discipline collapsing under hunger and cold. When one fainted again, 2 Red Cross nurses lifted her, whispering, "Careful. She's light as air." A diary from that camp recorded, "Some weighed less than 90 pounds. They feared us more than the war." And yet, something in that moment broke the script. The captured women saw compassion where they expected hatred. The enemy nurse's face, smudged with frost and exhaustion, looked nothing like propaganda had promised. One of the POW, a former signal operator named Liesel, whispered later in disbelief, "They looked at us not like enemies, but like patients." Snowflakes fell quietly as the train steamed empty behind them, disappearing into the night. The camp gates closed, but the tension didn't. Liesel, wrapped in the borrowed blanket, followed the nurse into a long barrack glowing faintly from within. She caught the faint scent of something impossible soap. The next shock would not be about freedom. It would be about cleanliness, dignity, and the smell of humanity returning. Steam rose in thin white ribbons from tin wash basins, curling toward the rafters of the barracks. The room buzzed with quiet disbelief. Red Cross nurses moved between rows of trembling German women, handing each a folded towel and, unthinkably, a bar of green Palmolive soap. The scent hit them like a memory from another life. For months, these women had washed with melted snow or grey water from ditches. Some hadn't touched real soap since the Reich still believed it could win. Liesel turned the bar in her hands, staring at the embossed letters as if it were a relic. The nurse, an Irish volunteer named Mary, smiled faintly. "Go on," she said, "hot water's ready." The German hesitated, glancing at the guard tower outside the window, half expecting a trick. But when she dipped her hands into the steaming basin, the sensation made her gasp. The warmth stung at first, then spread through cracked skin and bruised knuckles. Dirt and fear dissolved together. In those moments the camp smelled not of captivity, but of something painfully normal: soap, starch, damp cotton. According to Allied medical records, German POW rations averaged between 1,200 and 500 calories a day, barely enough to maintain weight, and soap was rarer than sugar. Yet here, in enemy hands, hygiene was sacred. A U.S. nurse noted in her log, "Even the captured deserve to feel human. That's medicine too." One of the women, a telephonist from Bremen, suddenly began to cry, loud, heaving sobs that startled everyone. The nurse crouched beside her, unsure if she was in pain. Through tears, the German woman choked out, "You gave us American soap while our own wounded rotted without it." It wasn't gratitude. It was grief, cracking open years of propaganda. The nurses didn't answer. They simply kept working, drying hair, replacing lice. infested uniforms with laundered ones marked POW. The Red Cross had rules. Cleanliness was the first step toward order, and order was the first step toward peace. Liesl caught her reflection in a tin mirror and barely recognized the face staring back. Less soldier, more survivor. As Mary tied a fresh bandage around her raw hands, she noticed something inked faintly under the grime. A small black eagle on the wrist. Liesl froze, eyes wide, waiting for rejection, but the nurse only said softly, "Hold still." The ointment burned. The silence burned more. The nurse's hand paused mid-motion. Beneath the fading grime on Liesl's wrist, the small Wehrmacht eagle stared back, a symbol that once meant pride, now only shame. The air between them went still, heavy with everything unsaid. Liesl's muscles tensed, waiting for the look of disgust she'd seen 100 times since capture. But Mary, the Red Cross nurse, didn't flinch. She simply breathed out and said, almost gently, "This'll sting a bit." Then she kept wrapping the bandage, layer by layer, as if the emblem didn't matter. The sting came from more than the ointment. In that sterile silence, something cracked deep inside Liesl, an understanding that kindness could exist without condition. She'd been trained to believe mercy was weakness, that the enemy's compassion was propaganda. Yet here it was, in warm gauze and a quiet nod. Around them, other nurses moved through the ward, tending frostbite, trimming hair, spooning broth into chapped lips. No speeches, no pity, just care. Reports estimate that by 1945, nearly 9 million German women had served in auxiliary roles: clerks, drivers, signal operators, medics. Many, like Liesl, were swept into uniform without choice, branded by the war machine, but not its ideology. Yet, in Allied eyes, they were still enemy personnel. To be treated as patients instead of prisoners felt like stepping into another moral universe. Mary noticed the faint tremor in Liesl's shoulders. "You're all right," she said softly, securing the bandage. The German swallowed hard, blinking away tears that threatened to betray her. For months, she'd seen only anger. In officers, in civilians, in her reflection. Now, this silence felt louder than rage. Outside, the wind howled through the camp fences, carrying snippets of distant news broadcasts, rumors of tribunals, of leaders captured, of horrors surfacing in places she'd never been but could no longer deny. She looked down at her clean hands, the white gauze glowing in the lamplight. Later that night, she whispered to the woman in the next cot, "For the first time, I felt clean, not forgiven." The sentence hung in the air like a confession. The barracks lights dimmed, and from the loudspeaker outside came a crackle. Then a voice, sharp, official, speaking of trials beginning in Nuremberg. The women turned toward the sound, faces tense. Tomorrow, the war would reach them again, this time through words. The next morning, frost still coated the wire fence like powdered glass. Beyond it, Allied guards smoked in silence, radios murmuring news from the trials at Nuremberg. Inside the camp, the women gathered near the fence posts, drawn to the sound like moths to a flame. The loudspeaker crackled with the voice of a British reporter, 22 defendants Goering, Hesse, Ribbentrop, each name hit like a hammer. The Red Cross nurses kept serving soup, but every spoonful felt heavier. Liesl sat near the fence, clutching her tin bowl. She listened as words like war crimes, camps, and civilians burned alive bled through the static. A woman beside her covered her ears. Another whispered, "They're lying." But the tone of the Allied announcer wasn't hatred, it was exhaustion. And that fatigue felt harder to argue with than any accusation. By November 1945, the Nuremberg trials had begun with 22 major Nazi officials, their crimes broadcast across Europe. The Red Cross nurses knew that many POW, especially women, had little idea of the full scope of atrocities. They didn't lecture, they just listened. When one of the Germans muttered, "We didn't know," Mary, the nurse, said quietly, "Then now you do." Her voice wasn't cruel, just steady, like someone setting down a mirror. For the first time, the captured women felt a different kind of captivity. Not behind barbed wire, but inside realization. Reports later described this as a psychological break, among POW who began to question not just the war, but their own obedience. One diary entry from a French camp reads, "We were not the ones in court, yet the guilt seeped through the fence. That night, silence blanketed the barracks." Some women cried softly, others stared at the ceiling as if the truth itself were written there. Mary moved among them, refilling canteens, her face unreadable. She didn't comfort them with lies. She just kept them alive long enough to confront the weight of survival. Morning came grey and windless. Liesel awoke to find Mary at her bedside again, holding something unexpected, a folded piece of paper. "They're looking for help in the infirmary," she said. "If you can stand, you can assist." Liesel blinked, uncertain. "Assist whom?" Mary smiled faintly. "Wounded Allied soldiers." And just like that, the lines blurred even further. The infirmary smelled of antiseptic and damp wool. Light filtered through frosted windows, settling on metal cots lined in 2 rows, half filled with wounded Allied soldiers. Their bandaged limbs, pale faces, and quiet groans made the air thick. Liesel hesitated in the doorway, still wearing her POW patch. A nurse handed her a bucket of clean water and said, "Start with the compresses." It felt surreal. A week ago, these men would have shot her on sight. Now she was pressing cool cloths against their burns. The first man she treated, a young British private with his arm in a sling, watched her cautiously. She expected suspicion, maybe a sneer. Instead, he nodded once and murmured, "Thanks." The word landed heavier than any insult. By 1946, Allied reports show that over 435 German POW across Western Europe were placed in labor or medical assistance programs. It wasn't punishment, it was reconstruction. In hospitals like this one, former enemies cleaned wounds, changed dressings, hauled supplies. It wasn't propaganda, it was necessity, but for the women it became something else entirely, a quiet education in empathy. Liesel noticed how the nurses treated every patient the same. French, British, even captured Germans, they all got the same ration of bandages, the same measured care. That equality stunned her. Back home, hierarchy had been worshipped. Now she was learning a different order, built on small mercies. "They trusted us with their injured," she later wrote in her diary, and in that trust, something inside us began to heal. At dusk, the infirmary settled into rhythm, clinking instruments, murmured prayers, the soft shuffle of boots. Mary passed Liesel a sealed envelope. "Mail run leaves tomorrow," she said. "Write home if you want." Liesel stared at the blank page, her hands trembling. Home, what did that even mean now? Her town might not exist. Her family might think she's dead. Still, she wrote, alive, captured, treated kindly. When the nurse collected the letters, she tucked Liesel's carefully among hundreds destined for the Red Cross post. "They'll send it," Mary assured her. "They always do." But weeks later, nothing arrived, no reply, no sign, only the long silence of a broken country. That's when the weight of distance began to hurt more than any wound. Weeks turned into months, and still, no reply. Every mail call felt like reopening a wound. The Red Cross truck would rattle into camp, tires crunching over gravel, and the women would gather in a ragged semicircle, breath held, waiting for their names. One by one, envelopes were read aloud. Some smiled, some cried, most just stared. But for Liesel, silence again. The nurse at the table gave a sympathetic shrug. Maybe next week. Inside the barracks, the mood shifted from hope to dull endurance. They began to count time not by days, but by mail runs. The Red Cross officers tried to explain. The system was collapsing under the sheer scale. By mid-1946, the International Committee of the Red Cross was processing over 20 million POW letters every month, shuttling between destroyed cities, new borders, and displaced families. Entire villages had vanished from maps. At night, women huddled under blankets, reading and rereading the few letters that did arrive. Paper smelling of smoke, sentences half, burned or water, stained. One message reads simply, "Alive, searching for you." Another, "Father gone, stay strong." Liesel had nothing. She began writing again anyway, 3 lines this time, tighter, less hopeful. Still here, still waiting. Mary noticed the way Liesel folded each letter as if it were fragile glass. One evening, while logging deliveries, she said quietly, "Geneva's backlog is months long. But sometimes if you know the right clerk," she stopped mid-sentence, watching Liesel's eyes lift. "You'd go all the way to Switzerland?" the German asked. Mary didn't answer, just smiled faintly, the kind that hides a plan. Across Europe, communication was chaos. Telephones worked only in fragments, postal routes shifted weekly, and Red Cross field offices were drowning in requests. Yet those paper threads, each envelope stamped with a red emblem, were often the only proof someone still existed. A French report from the time stated bluntly, "Mail is the oxygen of the camps." Days later, as a transport convoy prepared to leave, Mary approached the commander with a sealed dispatch. Her name was on the manifest destination, Geneva headquarters. "I'll find out," she told Liesel before boarding. The truck roared to life, headlights cutting through the dusk. As it disappeared down the frozen road, Liesel whispered to herself, "She's chasing my ghost." Snow blurred the borders as Mary's convoy crossed into Switzerland. What had started as a simple favor was now a mission. One name, one file, one proof of life for a woman history had nearly erased. The Red Cross trucks rolled through alpine passes marked with faded signs. Genève 20 km. Inside, crates of correspondence rattled, each envelope a heartbeat in exile. When she reached Geneva, the Red Cross headquarters hummed like a living archive, typewriters clattering, phones ringing, clerks moving in endless rhythm. Every wall was lined with index cards, each one a name waiting to be found. Mary handed Liesel's letter to a tired clerk in a grey vest. "Germany, small town near Hanover," she said. The clerk raised an eyebrow, half of its rubble, "But we'll see. That we'll see," carried the weight of millions. Reports from the ICRC show 65 National Red Cross societies working in post, or tracing operations. Millions of families searched for lost soldiers, missing prisoners, displaced civilians. Some letters found their targets after years, others never did. The system wasn't perfect, but it was the closest thing left to hope. Mary watched as the clerk disappeared into the archive, rows upon rows of handwritten files stretching into dim light. After half an hour, he returned, holding a faded card. "Found a match," he said. "One survivor registered, same surname, same village." He slid the paper forward like a relic. The message was short, barely legible: "Alive, home destroyed, waiting." Mary copied it carefully, then sealed the reply in an envelope bearing the Red Cross insignia. Her fingers shook as she stamped it. "POW Camp No. 124, France." It would take days to deliver, maybe weeks. But in a world that measured loss in millions, one letter could still rewrite a life. Before leaving Geneva, she walked through the sorting hall, one last time, rows of women, clerks in wool coats, stacks of papers tied with string, trucks waiting at the docks. She realized this was what war looked like when it tried to repair itself, bureaucracy fueled by compassion. As her transport rolled back toward France, snow began to fall again, soft, relentless, cleansing. Somewhere in the back, a single envelope with Liesel's name sat atop the pile, waiting to find its way home. The loudspeaker crackled at noon. Every woman in the camp froze mid. Motion, spoon paused, broom stopped, breath held. "Liesel Weber," the voice called. For a moment she didn't move, afraid she'd imagined it. Then Mary appeared at the barrack door, smiling just enough to make it real. In her hands, a thin envelope marked with the Red Cross seal, corners worn from travel. Liesel's fingers trembled as she opened it. Inside was a single sheet, typewritten, smudged by weather and time. The words were simple: "Alive, home destroyed, waiting." She read it again and again until the letters blurred. The room had gone silent. Even the guards turned away respectfully. For months she had imagined her mother buried under rubble. Now there was proof, thin as paper but solid enough to breathe again. The message had travelled through a labyrinth of compassion, from a nurse in France to a clerk in Geneva to a shattered street somewhere in Lower Saxony. The International Red Cross had reunited thousands of families this way, letters that moved slower than trains but faster than despair. By 1947, 11 million German civilians were displaced, scattered across the ruins of their own country. Yet here, in a French POW camp, one message had broken through the silence. Mary watched as Liesl pressed the paper to her lips. "It's her," she asked. Liesl nodded, tears streaking dirt down her face. "She's alive. She's waiting." Around them, other women began to whisper, hope passing through the barrack like a quiet current. For once, the news from Germany wasn't death. It was survival. Later that evening, Liesl folded the letter and tucked it inside her uniform pocket. She didn't sleep. She just kept rereading the line until dawn, afraid it might vanish if she blinked. Outside, the camp dogs barked at something beyond the fence, a figure staggering toward the gates. It was Mary, coughing, pale under the morning light. The nurse's voice cracked as she waved off help. "Just fever," she whispered, then collapsed into Liesl's arms. The world turned upside down again, rescuer becoming patient, comforter now the one in need. The letter trembled in Liesl's pocket as she ran for the infirmary. The infirmary smelled of disinfectant and wet linen. The air shimmered with fever heat, too thick for breath. Mary lay on a cot near the window, her skin waxy, eyes unfocused. Typhus had crept into the camp like smoke, quiet, invisible, merciless. Within days, half the nurses were bedridden. The line between caregiver and captive dissolved overnight. When the head medic collapsed, the women stepped in without orders. Liesl found herself holding the same basin Mary had once handed her, wringing out cloths in trembling hands. Every instinct said stay back, disease didn't care about uniforms, but she couldn't. "She saved me," Liesl whispered, pressing a damp compress to Mary's forehead. "Now I'll save her." Historical reports confirm that typhus outbreaks hit multiple POW camps in 1945-46, spread by lice, poor rations, and overcrowding. Mortality rates varied, but compassion often decided survival as much as medicine did. Inside this camp, German prisoners began caring for their Red Cross nurses, the same women who'd once served them soup. Guards, stunned, allowed it. One American corporal wrote in his journal, "Roles reversed. The prisoners work like saints. A Liesl scrubbed floors, boiled sheets, rationed water." She and 2 others kept the ward alive while the disease burned through. Every night she checked Mary's pulse, whispering stories about home, about the letter, about how hope had weight now. Mary's breathing rattled like torn paper, but she fought. Liesl prayed awkwardly, desperately, for a woman she'd met as an enemy and now couldn't imagine losing. On the 5th night, the fever broke. Mary's eyes opened, weak but clear. "Still here," she murmured. Liesl smiled, exhausted. "Rules are rules," she said, echoing the nurse's own words from months before. The camp doctor called it a miracle. Liesl called it repayment. By spring, the quarantine lifted. The Red Cross marked the infirmary as stabilized. But something permanent had shifted inside those walls. The women who had arrived as prisoners now moved like nurses, heads high, purposeful. When orders came down granting early release to a select few for distinguished conduct, Liesl's name was on the list. As she packed her things, she looked once more at Mary's cot. Empty now, blankets neatly folded. Outside, the gate waited. Beyond it, the long road home, the gates creaked open at dawn. A small convoy stood waiting, 2 trucks, 1 Red Cross jeep, and a handful of soldiers stamping their boots in the cold. Liesl stood among the selected women, clutching a cloth satchel, the Red Cross release papers folded neatly inside. Her name was read aloud, and for the first time in a year, she stepped beyond the wire without a guard behind her. The air felt wrong, too wide, too quiet. The road cut through fields scarred by shellfire, rows of shattered trees standing like gravestones. Inside the truck, silence ruled. A French sergeant passed around canteens of weak coffee. No one spoke. Freedom, it turned out, didn't feel like music. It felt like numbness. Through the window, Liesel watched villages flicker by stone walls pocked with bullet holes, children playing with helmets instead of toys. By late 1946, repatriation from Allied camps had reached its peak. An estimated 17,000 German POW returning home each week. For most, home was a technical term. Towns erased, families scattered, ruins where doorways once stood. The Red Cross provided travel passes, meager rations, and a promise. You are civilians now. But the mind doesn't switch off captivity that easily. At a train depot in Metz, Liesel changed vehicles. The station roof was gone, replaced by open sky. American engineers loaded crates of food onto freight cars stamped on WWII. She caught her reflection in a broken window face gaunter, eyes older, but somehow softer. The train lurched forward, carrying them east toward the ruins of Germany. The rhythm of the tracks became hypnotic, a heartbeat of endings and beginnings. Across from her, another woman murmured, "Do you think they'll forgive us?" Liesel looked at her, then out the window again. Maybe not, but maybe that's not the point. She reached into her coat pocket and touched the folded letter, the one that had found its way across half of Europe to remind her she still belonged somewhere. The train slowed near a destroyed town. Smoke curled from chimneys rebuilt out of brick and hope. On the platform stood a man in a patched Wehrmacht jacket, watching each face that passed. Liesel's breath caught. The silhouette was familiar, painfully so. The war wasn't quite done with her. Not yet. The man on the platform turned, and it was him. Her brother, Karl. Older, thinner, but unmistakable. The last time she'd seen him, he'd been in uniform, shouting orders over air raid sirens. Now he stood in a torn coat, the Reich insignia hastily ripped off, eyes hard as stone. For a second, neither moved. Then he said flatly, "You came back." They walked through what used to be their street, half houses, half ghosts. Roofs gone, walls blackened by fire. The smell of wet ash clung to everything. Inside their old home, only one room had a roof. A table, 2 chairs, a cracked portrait of their parents still hanging on a nail. Karl poured thin soup into chipped bowls. They ate in silence, except for the wind through broken windows. When she told him about the camp, about Mary and the nurses, his jaw tightened. "You cleaned their wounds, the enemy's." His voice rose, disbelief curdling into contempt. "You think they cared about you. You think kindness erases what they did to us." Liesel met his stare. "They cared enough to keep me alive," she said quietly. "Enough to find Mother." The letter trembled in her hand. Karl slammed his bowl down. "They brainwashed you. You sound like one of them." The argument burned hotter than the soup ever had. They weren't shouting about politics. They were shouting about survival, about guilt, about the right to feel human after losing everything. Across post, War Germany, over 8 million soldiers were demobilized, many clinging to bitterness as the only thing left that hadn't been bombed. Families split not by distance, but by what they now believed. Finally, Karl turned away, muttering, "You're broken." Liesel's reply came softly, but it cut deep. "No, Karl, I'm free." The silence that followed felt colder than the ruined walls around them. She stood, folded the letter once more, and slid it into her coat pocket. Without another word, she walked outside into the grey afternoon. Behind her, the door creaked shut. A sound like finality. In her hand, the corner of a photograph peeked out, Mary's face smiling faintly beneath a Red Cross cap. There was one thing she knew she had to do now. Write back. The paper was scavenged from an abandoned schoolroom, lined pages smudged with soot. Ink bartered from a neighbor for bread. Liesel wrote by candlelight, huddled near a wall still scarred with shrapnel. "Dear Mary," she began, then stopped. The word dear felt strange now, too soft for a world built on ruins. She crossed it out, tried again, to the nurse who did not turn away. The first sentences came haltingly, then poured like a confession. She told Mary about the journey home, about Carl's anger, about the silence of streets that used to echo with bells. "The world is quieter now," she wrote, "but it's not peace. It's the sound of people trying to remember who they were." She folded the letter, sealed it, and stamped it with a Red Cross emblem she had kept like a talisman. Across the new borders, the Allied postal system began reopening under Red Cross supervision. According to records, over 1.2 million letters were exchanged between Expo, W, and aid workers by 1948. Most were small, human fragments, thanks, memories, apologies. Each one an act of rebuilding invisible bridges across a continent still fractured by war. Weeks passed before an answer came. The envelope, marked Camp Rhymes, arrived with a faint scent of antiseptic and ink. Inside, Mary's handwriting was firm but tired, alive, still working. "Your words reached us. We read them aloud." Liesel pressed the paper to her chest, realizing she wasn't writing into the void. Somewhere, the nurses she once served were still in their white aprons, still mending the broken. Soon, other women in her village began asking for help writing their own letters, mothers searching for sons, widows hoping to trace husbands. Liesel organized them around the same kitchen table where she and Carl had once fought. She taught them how to write names clearly, to fold the pages tightly, to trust that kindness could still travel by mail. Her small corner of ruin became a miniature post station, women with pens instead of rifles, hope instead of orders. Every envelope that left her hands felt like a heartbeat sent across history. One afternoon, a visiting Red Cross officer arrived with a surprise Mary's signature on a volunteer roster from Geneva. "She's asking for you," he said. "The train hissed to a stop in Geneva, 1952. 7 years since surrender, but the sound of steam still made Liesel's heart race." She stepped onto the platform in a plain grey coat, the Red Cross invitation folded neatly in her pocket. Around her, Europe looked half-healed, half-haunted new buildings rising beside walls still pockmarked by war. A sign pointed toward the International Red Cross Conference. She followed it, breath quickening with every step. Inside the hall, rows of uniforms and suits blurred together, flags of former enemies hanging side by side. She spotted her name on a small badge, Liesel Weber, former POW, Germany. For a second, she almost turned around. Then, a familiar voice said behind her, "Took you long enough." Mary stood there, older, thinner, but unmistakably her. The Red Cross arm, and still bright against her white uniform, for a moment words failed them. Then Liesel laughed sharp, nervous, real, and Mary laughed too. It broke the tension like glass. They hugged, and the room seemed to fade away. They sat for hours in a corner cafe afterward, trading stories between the noise of clinking cups and conference chatter. Mary spoke of years in field hospitals, of refugee trains, of sleepless nights when memories wouldn't quiet down. Liesel told her about the letters, the women's writing circle, the slow rebuilding of their town. Both paused often, lost in the absurdity that two former enemies could be here alive, sharing coffee, discussing peace. Historical accounts note that by 1952, around 400 German POW were still missing, their fates uncertain. Yet for those who survived, the search for meaning mattered as much as the search for bodies. "We were both survivors," Mary said quietly, "just wearing different colors." A photographer from a local paper asked to take their picture for the conference newsletter. They stood side by side before the Red Cross banner, hands clasped, both smiling shyly. The flash popped, freezing the moment into film grain and light. Neither realized that image would become an emblem, proof that reconciliation didn't need declarations, just decency. When the shutter clicked, Liesel whispered, "You never stopped saving me." Mary replied, "You just learned how to save yourself." They didn't know that photograph would outlive them both. The flash left a ghostly burn in their eyes. For a second, neither woman moved the camera, capturing more than a pose, freezing 7 years of silence, guilt, and grace in one blinding burst. The photograph printed the next morning in a small Geneva paper under the headline, Former POW reunites with Red Cross nurse, a symbol of reconciliation. Neither of them read it that day. They were too busy walking by the lake, talking like old friends trying to rebuild a lost decade. The photo spread anyway. Allied newsletters picked it up, then West German newspapers, then international relief journals. Two women, side by side, one in grey wool, one in white, a Red Cross emblem glowing between them. Letters poured in to both their addresses, soldiers, widows, POWs, aid workers, all saying the same thing: we needed this image. By 1953, the symbol had gained weight. West Germany formally joined the International Red Cross movement that same year, pledging neutrality and humanitarian aid. For many, that black and white picture spoke louder than treaties. A historian later wrote, "Forgiveness found its first photograph." When Liesel finally saw it printed large in a magazine, she stared for a long time at the faces hers, gaunt but calm, Mary's, smiling faintly like someone who still carried ghosts. "We look older," she said. "We are," Mary replied. They laughed softly. The image was later displayed at a Geneva exhibition beside a caption, "Once enemies, now volunteers." Visitors paused, some weeping quietly. Others just stared, trying to decode what had changed in those two faces. The answer wasn't politics. It was something smaller, quieter. Compassion caught on film. Liesel donated her Red Cross armband to the display, along with the letter that had once saved her sanity. She touched the glass case and whispered, for those still waiting to come home. Mary placed her hand beside hers, their reflections merging briefly in the pane. Outside, church bells echoed over the lake, the same sound that once marked air raids, now signaling peace. The photograph would fade with time, but its story, two women, one war, one act of mercy, would keep being retold, passed through generations like a quiet rebellion against forgetting. And somewhere, that camera flash still flickered in history's darkroom. Decades later, the photograph resurfaced. Not in a newspaper this time, but in the hands of a young historian deep inside a Swiss archive. The air smelled of dust and old paper. Light pooled on the image like memory reborn. She turned it over carefully, revealing faint handwriting on the back, "For the one who taught me humanity isn't a side." The signature was faded but legible: L. Weber, 1952. The historian leaned closer. The two women in the frame, one in a Red Cross uniform, one in civilian grey, looked straight into the camera, unflinching. No medals, no ranks, just exhaustion turned into grace. She checked the records. Both had died years apart, Mary in 1974, Liesel in 1982. Yet here they were again, speaking through silver halide and film grain, outliving the war that had nearly erased them. In the corner of the archive box lay a file labeled Female POW, 1945-1947. Inside, brittle reports listed numbers with mechanical precision, over 200 zeros, 00 German women captured across Europe. Clerks, nurses, auxiliaries, mechanics most forgotten, their stories buried under statistics. But the photograph refused to let them vanish completely. Every war builds monuments to generals. This one had found its monument in two women who chose compassion instead of bitterness. Historians later used the image in lectures about post-war reconstruction, calling it the moment mercy went viral. It wasn't about forgiveness, it was about survival through decency. The historian placed the photo back in its sleeve and whispered, almost to herself, "They didn't just survive the war, they changed how it's remembered." The overhead lights flickered, catching the edges of the image like a heartbeat. Outside, Geneva's lake shimmered under soft morning sun. Tourists passed the old Red Cross building, unaware that behind those walls, kindness had once redrawn the lines of history. Somewhere beyond them, peace conferences were still being signed, crises still unfolding. But this picture, small and grainy, still spoke louder than all the speeches. It told of soap and soup, of letters and fevers, of a moment when enemies remembered they were human. The kind of story that doesn't end at echoes. And as the archivist filed it away again, she smiled. "Kindness," she murmured, "survived the war better than nations did."